Good morning, everyone. We find ourselves in the middle of what are proverbially called the Yoms, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, the Yom Yerushalayim, uh, the period which turns into a very busy period of Jewish commemoration, memory, observance, and even celebration at some of the modern experiences in the Jewish community. I had mentioned in an article over the weekend that May is Jewish American Heritage Month, which is a great thing. And there's a whole presidential proclamation and events that take place all over the country in all sorts of different places, but very few of them take place in the Jewish community. And the reason for that generally is because the Jews are really busy this time of year. May is this post-Pesach commemoration, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel, Memorial Day weekend, end of the season, celebration time. It's always very nice for America want to celebrate Jewish American heritage, but we're a little busy this time of year. So it's something that goes almost completely unnoticed in the Jewish community because we're busy living Jewish heritage or trying to instill more Jewish heritage. And that certainly comes certainly the case when it comes to Yom HaShoah, which was commemorated yesterday, Yom HaZikaron next Monday, Yom HaAtzmaut next Tuesday. And so I think it's appropriate to try and tackle some timely topics relating to these days. And in connection with Yom HaShoah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the righteous Gentile, or the righteous among the nations, and look at it both from in terms of just technically from a Shoah perspective, which is where it very much gets its association. In general, you want to know how something is associated and where it comes from, Google it, and you see most of the associations for righteous Gentile lead us to the Holocaust and Yad Vashem and the like. So in terms of its current understanding and application, also just a little bit of the history about righteous Gentiles, as well as the concept of the righteous Gentile, how looked at from a religious perspective, halachically, touch upon some ethical concepts and the like. So we're going to dive right in, and a lot of this material is found on Yad Vashem's website, which is very substantial. If anyone is looking for Holocaust information, they really link to all sorts of things and articles and guides and everything like that. But source number one, the righteous among the nations honored by Yad Vashem are non-Jews who took great risks to save Jews during the Holocaust. Rescue took many forms, and the righteous came from different nations, religions, and walks of life. What they had in common was that they protected their Jewish neighbors at a time when hostility and indifference prevailed. Right, and there have been studies done as to what motivated people to respond favorably when so many people did not. That's more of a psychological or an emotional, sociological analysis, and it's been done. I've had the opportunity. One of our children did this subject for history assignment, so she wrote about the motivations of righteous Gentiles. So that gave me an opportunity to look into some of the research that's done. I find it a little bit subjective. It's really hard to get into the soul of a person, but there have been attempts and interviews and the like. So what are the basic conditions for granting the title? One, active involvement of the rescuer in saving one or several Jews from the threat of death or deportation to death camps. Two, risk to the rescuer's life, liberty, or position. Three, the initial motivation being the intention to help persecuted Jews. Right? It can't be not for payment or any other reward, such as religious conversion of the saved person, adoption of a child, etc. And four, the existence of testimony of those who were helped, or at least unequivocal documentation establishing the nature of the rescue and its circumstances. So these are the four conditions, and just I'm happy to hear other reactions, but the idea of the mention of the mention of the initial motivation being the intention to help persecuted Jews. The Talmudic yeshiva bacher in me is noting that the initial motivation, right? They had to have done it initially for free, but that doesn't mean it had to remain completely, out of their own pocket. I mean, there could have been payments made subsequently, cover expenses and the like. I would imagine people are following the various different shows that are being released relating to Holocaust stories. One very, very, got a lot of attention recently is We Were the Lucky Ones, right? And within the show is some people being hidden by a Polish family, and there's a guarantee of a monthly payment. So I found myself thinking, is that Righteous Gentile? Is that for the money? What was the initial? There's a risk involved. It's not my determination to make, but it just there's a lot of Jewish chachma in some of these conditions. Most rescuers started off as bystanders. In many cases, this happened when they were confronted with the deportation or the killing of the Jews. Some had stood by in the early stages of persecution when the rights of Jews were restricted and their property confiscated. There was a point when they decided to act, a boundary they were not willing to cross. Unlike others, they did not fall into a pattern of acquiescing to the escalating measures against the Jews. Then also the idea that this, Yad Vashem is very much is connected into Israeli law. Knesset passed the Yad Vashem law. Holocaust commemoration is built into Israeli law. When they have the Yom HaShoah siren, the commemorations, this is built into Israeli law. There was Yad Vashem law, first in 1953. It was amended several different times. So then the end of source number one, the Yad Vashem law authorizes Yad Vashem to confer honorary citizenship of the state of Israel upon the righteous among the nations and commemorative citizenship if they have passed away in recognition of their actions. Right? The idea of they can, in general, we know Israel has Jews and non-Jewish citizens, but non-Jews, it's harder to become a citizen of the state of Israel, but a righteous among the Gentile can have some form of honorary citizenship, or it can be conveyed upon their posthumously. Sometimes it's passed on to their to descendants. And this idea just can be will be I think a springboard for conversation. What about halacha? Does halacha represent some type of rewarding for the righteous Gentile and the like? Questions, comments, reactions to the presentation of just the concept of the righteous Gentile as formulated in some of the material at Yad Vashem. Okay, and again, if anyone has wants to interject or you put something into the chat that you want to see covered, feel free to do so. So especially this idea of righteous Gentiles being given honorary citizenship. It was an article, a number of years ago in Jerusalem Post about righteous Gentiles in the Jewish state. And just not just the fact that there are righteous Gentiles, but they were moving to, some were moving to Israel. So source number two, righteous Gentiles, Chasidei Umot Olam, have been settling in Israel since the first years after World War II. The first group arrived in the early 1950s. A second, smaller wave followed the fall of the Soviet Union when righteous Gentiles from the Ukraine were permitted to come to Israel. To date, Yad Vashem has recognized, and this is 2007, 21,758 righteous Gentiles, most of them from Poland, the Netherlands, France, Ukraine, and Belgium. Of that total, 98 have chosen to live in Israel, and only 43 are still alive today, again, 2007. In the late 1980s, the Knesset enacted a law granting health benefits and a modest monthly stipend to righteous Gentiles and their spouses who settle in Israel. In the 1990s, after many delays, a cemetery was opened in Tel Aviv, especially for righteous Gentiles and their spouses. So the idea here, we're seeing that this honorary citizenship was something that a number took advantage of to move from honorary to actually living in Israel. And we also see how the state of Israel evolved in its treatment or its connection to these new citizens of Israel, the righteous Gentiles, in terms of providing benefits, and also had to deal with the fact that as a Jewish state, they needed a place to be buried. We've encountered that issue, with plenty citizens of Israel who are Jewish under the law of return, but not halachically Jewish, and where do they get buried? And so you have a kind of another category of citizenship and another category of non-Jewish citizenship that Israel had to gradually figure out what to do with in terms of the honorary citizenship coming into residency, coming into benefits, coming into burial, and the like. And as it can be expected with the passage of time, it's something that the numbers are dwindling, as it is the case with survivors of the Holocaust as well. So that's in terms of citizenship. Just in terms of the motivation, in terms of, we saw that there were conditions, and there's a snapshot from one righteous Gentile, just to highlight the religious motivation or the religious sensitivity, which I want to come back to, because I think that this idea of being motivated by a sense of religious ethics or religious duty is something that will reverberate in terms of Jewish responsibility the other way around. So this is from the Seder at the parish, and tells the story of a Don Gaetano Tantalo of Tagliacozo, Alto Italy. Not only hid 7 members of the Orvieto and Pacifici families, but went out of his way to enable them to perform the Jewish rituals. A devout Catholic, he was also sensitive to their religious requirements. He supplied them with Bibles, greeted them with Shabbat Shalom every Friday evening, helped them determine the dates of the Jewish holidays, especially Passover, according to the Jewish calendar. In fact, when they have a letter or a document of which he maintained the Jewish calendar and kept track of the Jewish calendar so that he'd be able to tell them when to celebrate Pesach. For the Seder, he supplied them with brand new dishes, helped organize all the necessary ingredients. A small piece of baked matzah from that auspicious Passover remained hidden among his belongings until his death. So just the idea of sometimes it being a spiritual, emotional response. We know that was not necessarily typical of the Catholic Church as a whole, or of people who consider themselves religious overall, but that it being the religion which seems to be a motivation. We're going to come back to him because of a comment that I think is helpful in terms of understanding the value of righteous Gentiles considering contemporary events. But the idea that it's something that there's a religious motivation, that it's not just saving a life in a technical sense, but Shabbat Shalom and ensuring their religious observance and the like, that it's not just technical. There's, and we're going to encounter that there are rules and regulations, and there are concepts of, and from the Jewish perspective, of Jewish particularity, of chosenness, of halacha, of saving lives, and the like. But what about the spirit that infuses the implementation of those concepts? And I think that this example of Father Tantalo, gives us just a snapshot of one person who seems to have acted with a religious sensibility suffused within his behavior. That wasn't always the case, and not everyone was as sensitive. And I'm not saying everyone's a saint and everyone's a sinner, but I think that this idea of religious motivation within the spirit of the law is something that we're going to come back to in terms of how Judaism relates to the righteous Gentile as a concept, as well as how Judaism treats some of these the idea of pikuach nefesh and the like, and we'll see that in the next couple of sources. So part of it is this idea of the idea of how the Jew relates to the Gentile is often clouded by the fact that Judaism is monotheistic and the Gentile world is viewed as polytheistic or idolatrous. The Jews are the chosen nation, everyone else isn't. So how does this, this sometimes leads to a sense of either Jewish superiority, and that's a whole separate topic, the idea of chosenness and superiority, but also in terms of a certain level of dismissiveness of the other, right? The idea of the Jew and the non-Jew. Sometimes the idea that the non-Jew is the category when you want to categorize negative behavior, it's the non-Jewish world, it's the Goyish world, right? Sometimes expressions or generalizations were made in like in Yiddish, shikr is a guy, right? Only non-Jews get drunk, right? The idea that we've sometimes cast the negative behaviors into the realm of the non-Jew comes from the fact that we have a lot of expectation placed upon us in terms of behavior. We are God's chosen. So that's the verse in Shemot. If you listen to my voice, you'll keep my covenant, and you'll be my treasured nation. From all of the other nations, God's in charge, and God chose us. So in many ways, we are chosen. So we're chosen, you're not, nana, 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 right? And on some levels, Christianity took this idea and inverted it when the Jews were cast into the exile, and they replaced us as the chosen nation. It's helpful for religion to put extra emphasis on responsibility or expectation, because that's a motivator to, or sometimes even it's the motivation to do more. Right, more is expected, but you're also the chosen, so that's the reward. So here the Sephornu comments, and you'll be a treasure among all people. Even though all types of humans are important to me above all the lower beings, because the idea of that everyone, Tselem Elohim, is something that is presented in Bereshit, but God is represented only in human beings. But Chazal say humans are beloved because they were created in His image. Chaviv Adam, right? Human beings are higher than the animals. Still, you will be treasured among them. And so it's just within the context of the Shaskin of chosenish that Forno also references the fact that yes, there's a certain segula chosenish element, but all of humanity has a certain elevated status, and it should that type of presentation that all human beings are special, Jews have a special responsibility. Is one way to move to a certain validation or appreciation for the non-Jew or the Gentile, while at the same time, sometimes we look more inwardly. So, source number 5 from this coming week's parsha: Lo telech rachil b'yamecha, don't be a talebearer. Right, the idea of not, part of no lashon hara, no gossip. Lo tamod al dam reyecha ani Hashem, don't stand idly by while your brother's blood is shed. I am the Lord. Right? Lo tamod al dam reyecha, don't stand idly by. It's very relevant for the conversation of a righteous Gentile saving a Jew from the Holocaust. They also didn't stand idly by. The Jew can't stand idly by. But this verse, similar to some of the others in our parsha, talks about lo tamod al dam reyecha, your brother, your fellow. Well, it's actually not your brother. It says reyecha is your fellow. There's a better translation than your brother. So how do we understand this? And some of the questions that come to mind. Well, what about non-Jewish life? Or from another perspective, what about non-Jews' responsibilities in their own communities to save other people? Right? We know from a moral view, it should be terrible to stand idly by while someone is in need, or someone is in pain, or someone is in danger. But from a Torah perspective, what are the expectations? Right? When we talk about Torah, we don't just talk about ethics and morals, we talk about obligations. So there's an obligation not to stand idly by. So this whole discussion, this whole mitzvah and responsibility is a whole discussion. Well, do you put yourself in danger to save someone else who's in danger? It's a larger conversation. And there are different views within the Talmud and the commentators and the halakhic authorities. For example, someone's drowning. Do you dive in to save them if you can't really swim that well yourself? You think you can, you're not sure. Or this comes up with the discussion: what about if you're a match for kidney donor? If that's the case, are you obligated to do so, or is it an option? There's some danger involved, not a lot of danger involved. These are some of the issues that come up, even within regard to this discussion from a Jewish perspective. So how do we, that's from the halachic perspective, but from a moral perspective, how do we understand the responsibility of non-Jews, even though non-Jews don't always have obligations? They have 7 Noachide commandments. So this isn't one of them per se. So within that conversation, Elie Wiesel invokes this verse, and he invoked in the source number 6 when he was speaking about the Darfur crisis a number of years back, 20 years ago already. I'm sure many people remember the Jewish community mobilized, and there was a huge round in Washington, D.C. So Elie Wiesel noted that then, Lo tamod adam reyecha is a biblical commandment: thou shalt not stand idly by the shedding of the blood of thy fellow man. That's how he understands reyecha. The word is not achicha, thy Jewish brother, but reyecha, thy fellow human being. Be he or she Jewish or not. All are entitled to live with dignity and hope. All are entitled to live without fear and pain. This is a moral statement. We talk about v'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha. They talk about, who does that apply to? When they talk about lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha, you can't hate your brother in your heart. What does it mean, your brother? Who's included in that statement? Is it humanity? Is it Jews? Is it observant Jews? But within that conversation, lo tamod adam reyecha, we have this springboard for more than just a legal discussion, but also a moral discussion. And that sometimes transcends the particularly Jewish borders of this conversation. And I think we'll see that unfold as we look at some of the rabbinic and halachic attitude towards the Gentile in general, how they're categorized. Like we know Jews, we talk about a tzaddik and a rasha, and someone who does the right thing and the wrong thing, or does the middling thing. And how does that play out in terms of how do we categorize non-Jews? And then in particular, what about those non-Jews who, for lack of a better term, exceed expectations? And we'll see what that means. Questions, comments, reactions, just on the presentation of the issue. Okay, so let's look at how the Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, look at the potential of the Gentile, of non-Jews. So Talmud Sanhedrin, source number 7. Rabbi Yoshua responded, is it stated in the verse that the sinners of the Jewish people will be like all of the Gentiles? Like they're saying, you have the person who does the right thing, the Jew who's righteous. Well, what about the Jew who sins? What's their spiritual level? Are they considered like Gentiles? Are they, how to categorize them? So one suggestion is they're considered like Gentiles, but it says all the Gentiles that forget God. Rather, the wicked shall be turned back to the net of the world. And who are they? They're the Gentiles that forget God. Gentiles who fear God do have a share in the world to come. So there's the idea that the Jew who sins is like a Gentile. Does that mean he's like a Gentile, that all Gentiles are created equal, or all Gentiles are judged equally? No, there are different categories of Gentile. There are those Gentiles who do the right thing, Gentiles who do the wrong thing, and therefore you have the Gentiles who are doing the right thing get rewarded and have a share in the world to come. So this statement of the Talmud is in the chapter in Sanhedrin that starts with Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek li'olam haba. All of Israel have a share in the world to come. So how is that? So what about other? What categories are compromised? So the Talmud talks about different levels of sin that deprive a person of the reward in the world to come. And here it's shifting over to Gentiles. The Meiri, in his commentary earlier in Sanhedrin, source number 8, any Noachide that we have seen has accepted upon himself the 7 Noachide laws as one of the righteous people of the world. It is included in the category of religious people and has a share in the world to come. The Meiri says, look, anyone who's accepted upon himself the Noachide laws, living a righteous life, that person is considered religious, has a share in the world to come. This is, the Meiri also, is very famous for having been one of the authorities to distinguish between idolater and non-Jewish. Right? The idea, for example, Christianity is not being viewed as idolatry, something that's raised by medieval legal authorities. Meiri is a little bit later than some of those initial positions, but the Meiri was the one who seems to embrace it more. When we're talking about non-Jew, when we're talking about a lot of things that keep the non-Jew in a more dismissive, lower category, that's the idolater, not the religious non-Jew. And Christianity, is not an appropriate religious system for a Jew because of the Trinity, but for a non-Jew, it's acceptable, and therefore Christians are religious people and shouldn't be in the same category as heathens or Gentiles or idolaters and the like. They are religious people and have a share in the world to come. The Rambam, Maimonides, has a similar approach, but in, I guess, classical, rational, analytical style, says that motivation matters. So the Rambam, introduces just very basically as a statement the similar thing that we've seen, that he's codifying essentially what the Talmud says in Sanhedrin and agreeing with the Meiri. Chasidei umos ha'olam, Chasidei, the pious of the nations of the world, yesh lahem chelek li'olam haba. They have a share in the world to come. But what does it mean to be a pious nation of the world or a pious Gentile? So source number 10, whoever accepts the 7 commandments of Noah and is careful to observe them is considered one of the pious members of the nations and has a portion of the world to come, right? Fine. However, right, this is like the caveat. This is true only if he accepts them and observes them because God has commanded them in the Torah and had Moshe inform us about them. You have to keep them because Hashem commanded them. However, if he keeps them purely because of his intellectual recognition, he does not have the status of a ger toshav, which is one of those categories that is removing the non-Jew from the idolatrous category. Rather, he's considered a sage. And it's actually in the Hebrew text, there's 2 different versions of the text. Either he does not have the status of a ger toshav, velo chacham. He's also not a sage, or he's not a ger toshav ela chacham. Rather, he is a sage. I think that the latter makes more sense, because basically you have someone who's observing the Noachide rules and is living a life in keeping with those practices, but he doesn't do so for religious reasons. He does so just because it makes sense, right? And not because there's any God. So the Rambam is recognizing that to be a righteous Gentile, you have to be a righteous Gentile who's walking the walk, but because you believe in God. And if you walk the walk, the behavior, but you don't believe in God, it's not enough. It's kind of a certain high expectation of combining practice with observance is not just the ideal in the Jewish world, but also in the non-Jewish world. And in many ways, that fits in with Maimonides having codified or quantified or categorized or introduced in the first place that there's a real system of Jewish belief. Right? The Rambam wasn't the first to talk about it, but the Rambam really was the first to create a whole system of Jewish belief and principles of faith, and that these are things that a Jew must actively subscribe to. Right? There are ani mamins. That's we hear that those are the words of Yom HaShoah. But for the Rambam, this is a responsibility and obligation. Not everyone agreed with the Rambam. However, it's the Rambam's formulations have become kind of the expectation of a Jewish belief system, even though Jews generally are not commanded or not expected to state their Jewish belief system. I always like to point out that the only time that Jewish law demands someone state they believe in God is the non-Jew before they convert. Non-Jew, one of the questions you ask a non-Jew as part of the conversion process is, do you believe in God? And are you willing to accept upon yourself the Jewish faith in the system of belief in God? Right? The rest of us never have to make that declaration. We may say ani mamins, but we never have to make that declaration as part of our obligatory Jewish service. So the Rambam is saying, we talk about the righteous Gentile, we have kind of the category of one who has moved away from idolatry, living in consonance with what God expects from humanity, the 7 Noachide commandments, and it's about practice. And the Rambam, though, says, yes, it's about practice, but it's also about faith. And that kind of resonates, when we talked about righteous Gentiles in the Holocaust, the religious motivations or sensitivities of those who did what they did for religious purposes, in terms of, maybe that has a certain twist to it in terms of a righteous Gentile for the Rambam is someone who's motivated by faith and is sensitive to faith, and not just someone who saves the life. Again, I think that we would probably, at the end of the day, tachlis, saving lives, doing the right thing, we believe in that. We are taught, lo hamidrash ha'ikar ela ha'ma'aseh. It's not the study, it's not the talk, it's not the discussion, it is the activity, it's the action. At the same time, the Rambam, opens us up to a little bit more of a faithful view of things, that it's not just about the action, it's about the faith, and we'll see how this gets understood practically. But we'll look at kind of maybe the other side from the Rambam, which has a very strong place in, and I think the narrative of the Jewish people, if not the same level of halacha. Questions or comments?
So, Rabbi, obviously the Yad Vashem doesn't go by that, by the Rambam's concept.
Correct. The state of Israel doesn't necessarily follow the Rambam. I think very famously, when Golda Meir became prime minister, they asked Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik about how does this fit in, with the Rambam and about a woman holding a position of authority. And Rav Soloveitchik says, well, they didn't ask the Rambam. So, I don't think we're necessarily expecting. Also, remember, this is a kind of an amorphous area of Jewish law. This is the Rambam. We're going to see whether this gets applied in a practical sense. Again, but it's Torah. And if we're trying to understand how Judaism relates to the non-Jew, we have our day-to-day interactions that, sometimes, are more practical in nature. And then we have, how Judaism views humanity and the role for humanity. And there's a technical, practical role that humanity is supposed to live a moral, ethical life of justice and of respect, etc. The 7 Noachide, right? Where the 7 Noachide commandments are to have a system of justice. and not to murder, not to steal, sexual, no adultery or sexual crimes. Then there's the no eating a limb from a live animal, right? And that seems like one of these things is not like the other. And then you have belief in God and do not blaspheme. So you have these 5 practical moral, activities that are supposed to just lead to the Yishuvo Shel Olam, the working of the world, and then you have these 2 faith ones that come up. So it's the person tasked for all this. My father-in-law is an expert in the Noahide movement and is a teacher in that movement. So we can you can pass on to him any questions you have about how they implement this practically.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
what percentage of the Israelis are Christian?
Well, I think that in Israel it's like 80% are Jewish. I think that there's or something like that. The overwhelming percentage of Israeli citizens are Jewish. Then you have your other 20% are essentially Arab, mostly Muslim, some Christian, but it's somewhere in that 80-20, 75-25 range.
They're
And
more
that leads
Arabs than Christians, right?
Oh, for sure. And it leads to and the state of Israel has no civil marriage. The rabbinate is control of all marriage and divorce. The Islamic side, there's an Islamic parallel to that, but there's if you're not Christian or Muslim, or you don't want a religious ceremony, you're out of luck in Israel. And that's what they call the Cyprus phenomenon of a lot of people going to get married in Cyprus, because marriage is performed outside of Israel and then recognized in Israel. But then the divorces would have to go through the rabbinate. So you could have a situation of a couple that gets married, goes to Cyprus, comes back, lives their life. If at some point they want to get divorced, you can't just go to court and get divorced. You have to go to the rabbinate to get divorced. So there's this, pathway that has to get followed if you want to get divorced in Israel that involves the rabbinate, even if you didn't involve the rabbinate in marriage. So the Rambam presents this idea: you got to walk the walk, but it also has to be a Chasidei Umas Olam, to be the righteous Gentile, has to involve faith as well. So here's I think an example from the Talmud that doesn't seem to require all that. Source number 11, Avodah Zarah 18a. This is the story of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, right? This is one of the 10 martyrs who were being executed by the Romans for their continuing to teach Judaism. The executioner said to him, "My teacher, if I increase the flame and take off the tufts of wool from your heart," right? He's being burned, and he's being wrapped in wool, and he is being burned with the Torah scroll around him, so that you will die soon after and suffer less. Will you bring me to life for the world to come? Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said to the executioner, "Yes." The executioner said, "Take an oath for me that what you say is true." He's like, "I don't want you just to say yes. How can I trust you? To swear." Hanina ben Tradion took the oath for him, and the executioner immediately increased the flame and took off the tufts of wool from his heart, causing his soul to leave his body quickly. The executioner too leaped and fell into the fire and died. A divine voice emerged and said, "Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion and the executioner are destined for the life of the world to come." Upon hearing this, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wept and said, "There is one who acquires his share in the world to come in one moment, such as the executioner, and there's one who acquires a share in the world to come only after many years of toil, such as Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion." So here you have a story of a Gentile receiving the world to come, which we said it makes one a righteous Gentile, without necessarily the life of Noahide law or even an expression of faith. Again, you could say we don't know what's inside his heart, but the Talmud seems pretty clear that a little bit of a one and done situation here, that he gets his reward, just for his quote unquote favor in hastening the death of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion. This seems to be an example of a less technical form of righteous Gentile. That the key, what was the key criterion? Helping the Jew, and we're going to see, we're going to see kind of a synthesis of both the Rambam approach and this type of, instinctive supporting the Jew approach of righteous Gentile play out in a question asked to Rabbi Moshe Sternbach. I see Phyllis, you have your hand up.
Yes, we spoke about Noahide people, And I don't know if anyone has ever met a Noahide, and I know one who is an amazing man. He is part of our Williamsport congregation. Of course, he's not counted, for the minyan, but he's a man probably about 70-ish. And he observes, he's head of a congregation of Noahides. They have their own Torah, they observe the laws. He goes to Israel constantly. An amazing person. He has no desire to convert. He's very happy, in his place, but he really enhances the Williamsport congregation. It's really fascinating.
Well, it's nice to have friends. And I think there's, I believe, for having spoken to my father-in-law about this before, there are several 100,000 Noahides. On the one hand, it's an extension of this idea, the Rambam mentioned as ger toshav, which was this idea of that the non-Jews who accepted upon themselves the Jewish control over Israel and to keep the 7 Noahide laws and support the Jews. It's an extension of that concept. And as you say, you mentioned he has no desire to convert. On some level, it's a middle. You're kind of on the fence, because you're not part of the Jewish people, and you don't have the fellowship of Christians or another religious movement. So it's a little bit can seem a little bit lonely, but they have created some community. I think they've created a tallis with 7 stripes for the 7 mitzvot of commandments of Noahide laws. They celebrate Shabbat. They don't observe Shabbat the full way, right? That's kind of an interesting cross conversation. While Judaism recognizes this idea of the righteous Gentile, it also creates certain obstacles from the Gentile fully connecting with Judaism. So there's the famous expression also in that chapter of Sanhedrin that a non-Jew who observes the Sabbath is liable for the death penalty. And it seems like very shocking. Like, what's so bad about that? And there's a whole discussion that it's the idea of a non-Jew who is trying to create a religion similar to Judaism from a religious perspective while not being Jewish. This leads to the whole discussion that if someone's converting to Judaism, part of their conversion process is to live Jewishly. How can they live Jewishly if they can't practice Shabbos? So, so one of the things, that conversion candidates often go through, is being told, to the one thing not to do. So sometimes, they're told, turn the light switch on once on Shabbos or the like. It is, there's Judaism, there's non-Judaism. We appreciate and validate the righteous Gentile. At the same time, we're not looking for the Noachite to cross the Rubicon into being too Jewish. The whole idea in terms of that, that was, the Rambam talks about the role of Christianity and Islam as being mediators for the idolater, the heathen, to focus, to be moralized, and to create a more ethical world, even if it's not kind of an absolute Noahide expectation for the non-Jew. Some would say the proof is in the pudding, that these movements have, far exceeded being just technical and practical in terms of, that there are billions of Christians and Muslims who have, chosen that path as opposed to the more pristine, maybe too boring Noahide path. But and what often happens, or not often, but in experience in some of the families that I have met or encountered through my father-in-law, a proud Noahide patriarch ends up with a lot of Jewish children and grandchildren, because you're so close to the flame that you sometimes that final step is I don't want to say inevitable, but more expected.
So in Nashville, isn't Nama from Nashville?
No, she grew up in Memphis, but we live in an internet age, so he's been teaching online for years now, and so it's more in the South. I would say generally, off the beaten path, and not necessarily in, the larger cities. But go online, noahide.org. Put it this way, I am sure I'm not ashamed when I'm looking for something online. I Google. So when you Google a lot of the subjects related, some of the phrases relating to this topic, like righteous Gentile, or the like, you'll have Holocaust for most of it. And if you change the phrase around a little bit, you'll get Noachide for the rest of it, and you'll find like 3 Jewish sources. This isn't an area that is as robust. I think source number 12, Rabbi Sternbuch, kind of is one example that kind of merges it together, because he's addressing is it a mitzvah to participate in the funeral of a righteous Gentile and to give a eulogy? Right, attending a funeral is a mitzvah. Well, what about the mitzvah of what about the funeral of a righteous Gentile? So he quotes the Beit Yosef, which quotes that you have to accompany. There's a responsibility to accompany a non-Jewish body at a funeral also. So the Beit Yosef asks, well, where do we find that? Who said, why are we accompanying a non-Jewish dead person? Beit Yosef says we're talking about a righteous Gentile. He has a share in the world to come. As we've seen. So then he says the Rambam, this is the one that we looked at. They have a share in the world to come. So he said, the Rambam says to be a righteous Gentile, you have to believe in God commanding this, and not just to do it because it makes sense or because it's part of society. Right? It seems from the Beit Yosef, no, it's not required. A non-Jew who is mitchased, who does chesed with a Jew, has a share in the world to come. Then the Rav Sternbuch goes up, but near the it has to be someone who's living those laws. So Rav Sternbuch, quotes this source and the discussion about the source. Is it a non-Jew? Is a righteous Gentile one who is believing in God, or is it just doing the right actions? And he says that umeata nirash akum zeshasa tovot Yisrael, that non-Jew who did good things for the Jews, lo rak shemutar lavoto, not only is it permissible, ela mitzvah nami have it rak talmud Torah mevatlin. It's a mitzvah, but you shouldn't cancel the Torah lecture that day. You should give a eulogy, so especially because if this non-Jew did good things for us, we should let that be known, so maybe others will do as well. It works out good for the Jews. So in a practical question of what's considered the righteous Gentile, our responsibility towards the righteous Gentile, there's certainly, this Rav Sternbuch introduces references how do we define a righteous Gentile, and acknowledges that the righteous Gentile may not be the Rambam's righteous Gentile, but someone who does good for the Jews is deserving of our reciprocal kindness as it pertains to funeral and eulogy. And in many ways, the idea of gratitude extends beyond just the Jew. In one of the references, a very popular reference that evokes this sentiment, we have on the Purim holiday where we say "V'gam charvona zachor latov," built into the Shoshanat Yaakov liturgy. After the Megillah, charvona gets a lot of mention, and that expression comes from the fact that rabbinic literature highlights on the role of charvona, making that suggestion that Haman should be hung on the tree that he wanted to hang Mordechai, and the fact that it's in the Megillah is deserving of mention, and that gets expressed in Gam Charvona Zachor Latov. He deserves a good mention. Who is the other personality who has that type of language associated with him? I guess a biblical source for that expression, Zachor Latov. Anybody?
Eliyahu Navi.
Excellent. Eliyahu Hanavi. So here, right, Eliyahu Hanavi is Zachor Latov. So, we're taking Charvona, the non-Jew, who had a role, not a primary role, but a role of goodness in the Megillah. We're putting him up there with Eliyahu Hanavi. So, that the idea of showing gratitude, certainly, makes sense. So, the idea, going back, referencing, the example of Don Tantalo, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik wrote an article, about where he brings up the story of Don Tantalo, and you can see more of it. It's if you go to the Yad Vashem website, it's more at length. But this idea of the role of the righteous Gentile, the concept of the righteous Gentile, in addition to our responsibility, how to define it, our treatment towards it, right? Israel's treatment towards it, our treatment towards it, Rav Schnurbuch. The idea of someone who has the moral clarity and the moral motivation and takes action on that is something that's reassuring in a time when most of the language that gets rises to the top of the news is the haters. And so in source 13, Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, as thousands upon thousands participate in anti-Semitic rallies around the world, as we see assaults on Jewish businesses in England and Spain, the burning of synagogues in Tunis, it is clear that hatred of Israel reflects the twisted theology of anti-Semitism. We can thus have no better source of inspiration than a priest who during the Holocaust created a calendar that embodied Jewish time and Jewish eternity. Yad Vashem possesses a postcard sent after the Nuremberg trials by Don Tantalo to one of the Jewish families. He had written on the card in Hebrew letters the words of Psalm 34, affliction will bring death to the wicked, and those that hate the righteous shall be found guilty. He saw the conviction of Nazi officials as a fulfillment of the biblical time, a defeat of the Amalek of his age. The idea that we're not the only ones who get it. They may not get as much attention, and it may not make the headlines. But this idea of the Chasidei Umos Ha'olam is something that had a technical application, was something that the rabbis considered, even if they didn't necessarily meet as many of them throughout history. We appreciate the more sophisticated religious practice and theology of the righteous Gentile. From the Gemara and Avodah Zarah, we appreciate the righteous Gentile's kindness towards the Jew as deserving of recognition. We put that into play practically as a halachic concept in practice today, as we saw in Rabbi Sternbuch, and hopefully recognize that there's a certain goodness and morality that extends beyond our people. Kain Yerbu, hopefully we'll see more of it.